So I would ask you, with your very sincere and warm applause, welcome to the stage the Honorable John Bolton.
I am delighted to be here today. I'm also sure the leadership of North Korea is delighted that I'm here today in a private capacity. At least that's what I've read. Perhaps they'll be a little less delighted now that I can speak in unvarnished terms about the grave and growing threat that the North Korea nuclear weapons program poses to international peace and security. Let's start with a couple of what I think the main precepts of dealing with the North Korean nuclear weapons threat are. First, it remains unacceptable for North Korea to have deliverable nuclear weapons. Now, by the word unacceptable, I don't mean some rhetorical flourish by a politician. I mean that our policy should be that we do not accept it. We will not accept it. Second, it seems to me clear that the DPRK has not made a strategic decision to give up its nuclear weapons. In fact, I think the contrary is true. I think the strategic decision that Kim Jong-un is operating through is that he will do whatever he can to keep a deliverable nuclear weapons capability and to develop and enhance it further. He may try to get relief from international sanctions. He may make some concessions. But under current circumstances, he will never give up the nuclear weapons voluntarily. Now, this is, if you will permit a personal observation, this question of whether there is a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons is what the Libya model of 2003 and 2004 properly understood actually means. At that period, we saw Muammar Gaddafi make an unambiguous decision that he and Libya would be better off without developing nuclear weapons. He came to that decision for a variety of reasons, because of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein by a U.S.-led coalition, the subsequent capture of Saddam Hussein, and the seizure of the ship, the BBC China, and its delivery of nuclear components, uranium enrichment components, manufactured by the AQCON proliferation network, that told him that we knew what he was up to. And at that point, he made the clear decision that he was going to give up nuclear weapons. We have seen not only nothing like that from North Korea, as I say, we have seen the opposite. And I think it's important to understand that the current North Korean moratorium on testing of nuclear weapons and testing of ICBM, intercontinental range ballistic missiles, tells us nothing about either North Korea's intention or its strategy as it's playing out. One reason, one very good, very troubling reason why there's no more testing of nuclear weapons for the moment or of long-range missiles is that North Korea has, in its judgment, for well or ill, finished testing and can produce nuclear warheads and long-range ballistic missiles. That's not an encouraging sign. That's a sign to be worried about. Moreover, the testing of shorter-range ballistic missiles that we've seen in recent months doesn't give us any reason to think that those are not threatening, because the capabilities, the technology, things like maneuverability of close-range or short-range ballistic missiles, by definition, can be adopted to longer-range ballistic missiles. So that indeed the testing that's going on now is not unthreatening, unless, of course, you happen to be in South Korea within range of these missiles, but bodes poorly for the defensive capabilities of Japan and even the United States when you get to the intercontinental range. Now, in the past, we had been very clear what our expectations were of North Korea, both with respect to nuclear weapons and ballistic missile testing. If you look back to UN Security Council Resolution 1695, adopted on July the 25th, 2006, and Security Council Resolution 1718, adopted on October the 14th, 2006, after in the first instance, 1695, after North Korea broke its moratorium on launch testing of ballistic missiles from the Korean Peninsula, and for 1718, after a nuclear weapons test, the United States and the Security Council were very clear in their response. I know this because I helped write both of those resolutions. 1695 dealt only with missiles. 1718 dealt with both, and I'll quote from 1718 just to remind everybody how clear it was. In operative paragraph 2, the unanimous Security Council said, and I quote, demands that the DPRK not conduct any further nuclear test or launch of a ballistic missile. And in operative paragraph 5, the Council said that it decides that the DPRK shall suspend all activities related to its ballistic missile program, and in this context reestablish its pre-existing commitments to a moratorium on missile launching. North Korea today, as we speak, is violating those resolutions. Now, I say this not because of a theological commitment to UN Security Council resolutions. I say it because when the United States, having led the fight to get those resolutions, says we really don't care, other countries can draw the conclusion that they don't really care about the sanctions contained in those and other resolutions. So when you ask for consistent behavior from others, you have to demonstrate it yourself. And when we fail to do that, we open ourselves and our policy to failure. Now, remember also what it is that caused the concern in 2006 when North Korea broke this moratorium. In 1998, North Korea for the first time launched a ballistic missile that landed in the Pacific Ocean east of Japan, which, needless to say, got the attention of people in that country. And the moratorium was intended to signify that North Korea was behaving in a more responsible fashion. And yet the only thing they really gave up was launch testing. Static testing continued, a very important part of missile development. And all of the evidence we have in the public domain is that North Korea simply shifted its emphasis on launch testing to cooperation with Iran, which was also developing Scud-based missile technology to create delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So that the 1998 Taepodong launch by North Korea and the subsequent enhancement of cooperation with Iran was actually a clear demonstration not of responsible behavior, but of the continued aspiration to have deliverable nuclear weapons. So I think right now we are in a classic standoff with North Korea. They want a piece of something that we should not be prepared to give them. Now, people will say, but what can be hurt? What can be lost by negotiation? What about partial agreements? Why not have some progress, look for some indication of something that North Korea can do that will allow us to alleviate the sanctions? There are several points, I think, that are important to understand here. If you believe, and you may not, if you believe it is unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. First, for the would-be proliferator, a partial lifting of sanctions is far more important than it is to the opponent of proliferation to have a partial cessation of a nuclear weapons program. The history, whether it's with respect to North Korea or Iran, is very clear that the economic kick to the proliferator of getting economic benefits and relief from sanctions is far more beneficial than a marginal reduction in the nuclear weapons effort. So from the perspective of the proliferant country, action for action, as the North Koreans call it, is a way to sustain their authoritarian political system, keep their economy going, and yet still have the benefit of the bulk of their ballistic missile and nuclear programs. And there's a world out there that's ready to fall succor to that kind of argument. Even now, we see governments, particularly South Korea, watching North Korea test KN-23 and KN-25 missiles, but providing them food aid because the North Koreans say their harvests have been bad and economic conditions are difficult. Not so difficult they can't launch ballistic missiles, but too difficult to buy food for their people. And as I say, there are people who succumb to that line of argument. Now, this is, I think, something that we can apply this lesson both to Iran and North Korea, because there's a second common element as well, and that is the element of time. Time for a would-be nuclear weapons state is not a neutral factor. In fact, the more time that goes by, almost inevitably benefits the proliferant, because it takes time to overcome the complex scientific and technological difficulties inherent in a nuclear weapons program. So when we say, well, we're in no rush for negotiations, we're in no rush for a resolution of this, we're saying to North Korea and Iran, take your time, keep going. You've got more time to plan, to test, to produce, to deploy these capabilities. Time works against those who oppose nuclear proliferation, and a relaxed attitude to time is a benefit to the likes of North Korea and Iran. And then finally, and this applies specifically to the circumstances on the Korean Peninsula, for about a year and a half, the United States and South Korea have not had what some called war games. We have not had large-scale military training exercises. Now, I'll leave it to the Pentagon to describe exactly what we have been doing, but I think you're all familiar with what I'm talking about. It is inevitable that when exercises are not taking place, readiness can come into question. And a failure to be militarily prepared results in a weakening of structures of deterrence. Now, I'm not going to make any assertions here today about the level of American and South Korean readiness on the peninsula, but someday, whether from the Department of Defense or from congressional investigation, we are going to hear judgments on what military readiness is. And I think that this is something that should be a priority both for Americans and for South Koreans. Now, there are other issues here that I don't think are currently adequately addressed in the public debate. Not only should we be concerned with North Korea's own weapons technology, but to the ongoing danger that North Korea will sell nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology or actual weapons and missiles themselves to other aspiring proliferant states. That is a risk of a nuclear-capable North Korea, whether North Korea itself is a threat in its immediate region. Now, I also believe that there is only one country in the world that can stop nuclear proliferation, and we're in it. We can use help, that's for sure, but if the United States fails in this mission, there is no other state or combination of states and no international organization that can be a substitute. If we fail, nuclear proliferation succeeds. Now, let me just read to you a quotation from Winston Churchill. It's a very pessimistic statement that he made to Parliament in 1935. But I think it applies to American policy over something like 30 years when it comes to North Korea. Churchill said, describing Germany, of course, he said, when the situation was manageable, it was neglected. And now that it is thoroughly out of hand, we apply too late the remedies which then might have effected a cure. There is nothing new in this story. It is as old as the Sibylline books. It falls into that long, dismal catalog of the fruitlessness of experience and the confirmed unteachability of mankind. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. Now, let's hope that Churchill's pessimism is not borne out in the case of North Korea. There are things we should look to and have serious discussions about. One is the possibility, limited though it may be, of regime change in North Korea. Second, we should look at and discuss with China, and we should have done it long ago, aiming toward the reunification of the peninsula under a freely elected government like that in South Korea. And third, if you believe, and you may not, that it is unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons, at some point, military force has to be an option. Now, this is obviously the most controversial subject, and many people say it's just unimaginable that you would use military force. So let me quote to you the words of General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On his last day, I might say, as chairman, he's done an outstanding job. He said this to the Aspen Institute seminar in the summer of 2018 on this question of what's unimaginable. General Dunford said, "But as I've told my counterparts, both friend and foe, it is not unimaginable to have military options to respond to North Korea's nuclear capability. What is unimaginable to me is allowing the capability to allow nuclear weapons to land in Denver, Colorado. My job will be to develop military options to make sure that doesn't happen." I think General Dunford was completely correct. Now, if you don't like those options, there are others too that ensue when North Korea keeps nuclear weapons. The DPRK could become the new AQ-CON, the Walmart or the Amazon of deliverable nuclear weapons. Or you could have more nuclear weapon states in Asia, like Japan, like South Korea. So these are questions that need to focus our attention, not can we get another summit with Kim Jong-un, or what the state of staff-level negotiations are to achieve a commitment from North Korea it will never honor. Now, before I close, I want to take 1 minute on the subject of U.S.-Japan-South Korea relations. This is also not a happy subject for discussion of the moment. It's well below the radar screen here in the United States, which is a big mistake for our country in not paying more attention to it. I am almost without words to describe how distressed I am that these tensions between South Korea and Japan have grown to the point where they currently are. I believe that over the past period of time that American passivity on this point has been a mistake. I'm not saying that the United States should engage in public mediation between the two countries. I think, in fact, a public participation would be a mistake. And I'm not underestimating how serious the issues between South Korea and Japan are. I've heard at length from both sides, and I think I understand well both their logic and their emotions. But I think if the United States does not operate here, we face a very serious deterioration of alliance capabilities at precisely the wrong time. We see at this point that the hub and spoke system of alliances that we've had in the Asia-Pacific region is in need of modification toward a richer, deeper cluster of relations. We've seen efforts at trilaterals with the U.S., Japan, and Australia, with U.S., Japan, and India. These are all signs of progress. So to see South Korea and Japan moving in effect in the opposite direction from the U.S. point of view is extraordinarily troubling. This is something that if the other disputes that have ensued in the past few months had made clear, the South Korean decision to suspend the General Security of Military Information Agreement, GSOMIA, has really now brought to an acute point, because this has a palpable impact on American ability to coordinate among our various allies. I put this down as something that requires urgent attention by the United States. Now, all of these concerns and everything we could say about China's growing international threat, militarily, politically, and economically, point to significant risks and dangers in and around Korea. I think there should be better burden sharing on issues like military base costs, as we're now discussing analogously in the NATO context. But this is not the time for U.S. disengagement or withdrawal. It is a time for more U.S. involvement and leadership on the Korean Peninsula, in Asia, and worldwide. More, not less. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bolton. That was wonderful, wonderful remarks on the Korea issue and more broadly about U.S. foreign policy in Asia. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Korea Chair here at CSIS, Professor and Vice Dean at Georgetown University, and I want to welcome everybody to the CSIS 중앙일보 Forum. I hope that you all stay with us. I know Ambassador Bolton's the main attraction, but I hope you'll stay with us because we have a great day planned, including 2 additional keynote remarks by former Foreign Minister Song-Min Soon and Undersecretary of Defense John Rood. My role here is to facilitate a conversation with Ambassador Bolton based on his remarks, as well as ask you some questions from the audience, which we've collected in advance. My challenge is that you've answered almost all the questions already that I had in mind. But let me begin with where you left off, which is the Japan-Korea relationship. And I guess the question I would have for you initially is, what specifically should we be doing then? What should we be proposing some sort of solution? As you know, for the Koreans, it's this whole question, at least immediately, about the whitelist, and for Japan, it's being the termination of the GSOMIA agreement. Is there anything specifically that you would propose on this? And also, as dysfunctional as this relationship has become, who is benefiting from that?
Well, I think actually the answer to the last question is the easiest. I think China and Russia are benefiting from this split. And it's something they can only take delight in, that this effort to try to weave together a more effective South Korean, Japanese, American presence in the region, bringing others in as well. I think the free and open Indo-Pacific, for example, has been a major conceptual step forward in American policy under this administration. It's all thrown in severe jeopardy by the split. Now, part of the problem in the dispute is that it's asymmetric. From the South Korean side, at least in some parts of the political spectrum, the origin of the split is the perceived unfairness in the 1965 treaty that that, at least at the time, both sides saw as turning a page in history to say, okay, whatever Japan did before in the 1895 to 1945 period, we're going to resolve, and that's it, and it's finished. That has now been called into question, which obviously causes deep uncertainty about the future relations in Japan. And I might say it ought to cause everybody here to understand that puts deep uncertainty into any possible Japanese involvement in economic development in North Korea if and when there were ever a successful nuclear deal. Because if anybody thinks the Japanese are going to open their checkbook to North Korea after they thought they had solved that problem with South Korea and saw it unstuck, it's not going to happen. That is a very broad and difficult historical issue to talk about in both countries. Japan responded with economic retaliation that I think took South Korea by surprise. I think it unnerved South Korea. I don't think they understood the risk that they had undertaken when they challenged the 1965 treaty. And then it deteriorated further with the suspension or termination of Jusomia. So the best I can say at the moment, at least I hope the best I can say, is that they've hit a plateau and things are not deteriorating further. And at this point, I'm not sure that the discussions that are going on the bilateral discussions have any prospect of reversing the conflict as it now stands. So I think there's an awful lot of work to do in trying to get this back on track, and I'm not even sure at this point I would know where to begin. And that's something people should be thinking about, because the longer the split goes on, that I do have confidence I can say weakens all three of us further.
Thanks. The very last line of your speech, you said that this is not a time for U.S. disengagement from Asia. Do you sense that we are disengaging from Asia?
Well, I think there's a risk of it. I think that I don't want to make this a partisan comment, but I'll just say in our two great political parties, one of them has a very vestigial national security wing. You don't hear about the Scoop Jackson Democrats anymore. You don't even hear about the Joe Lieberman Democrats anymore. Within the Republican Party, there has always been a residual isolationist component. I would have to be, it pains me to say this, but I would have to say that the strength of that component has been rising recently. And the notion that you could have both major parties with a withdrawn sense of American involvement in the world other than more slavish devotion to what the UN General Assembly does, I find very troubling.
You mentioned in your remarks about exercising in readiness. We are in a period now where the U.S. and South Korea have greatly modified or moderated the level of exercising we're doing on the peninsula. You mentioned it could eventually hurt readiness. Maybe it's not happening today, but eventually it will hurt readiness. I guess the question there is, more broadly speaking, do you think that it's a bad policy to be negotiating equities in our alliance for something that I assume you think is not achievable, which is at least the strategic decision by North Korea to pursue denuclearization?
Well, I think the U.S. and its allies should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think it's a high priority for the United States in particular not to let North Korea do as it tries repeatedly to do, to drive a wedge between us and North Korea. Sometimes that's easier for them to do, sometimes it's harder for them to do. I think it would be better to have an adult conversation on the burden-sharing subject simultaneously with an adult conversation on what we really think Kim Jong-un is going to do. And this is a question, obviously, that divides the body politic in both countries, and we'll see what happens in the next several months. I think on the readiness point, as I say, I'm not making any judgments here myself. But I do think that authoritative voices on this need to be heard, and people need to decide if you're not going to be ready to fight. You know, the slogan of our forces in Korea is "Fight tonight," and that's the only slogan that they and the South Koreans can have, given the nature of the threat. If they're not ready to fight tonight, I have to ask for the safety of the Americans whether they should be there or not. And that's why this question of the effect of the diminution of the exercises, the effect on military readiness, seems to me to require authoritative study.
When you were last in government during the Bush administration, I remember that you were quite involved in the creation of the first sort of smart sanctions campaign against North Korea. I think back then we called it defensive measures. You were also involved in the creation of PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative. I'm curious, when you came back into government this time and you saw the portfolio of UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, is very different from back then when we had basically two, right? 1695 and 1718. So my first question is, do you feel like the current sanctions regime against North Korea is more robust than it was when you were last in government? And is that something that the United States should give up and negotiate away, or is it something that we should hold on to?
Yeah, I think since those two initial resolutions, each time North Korea has detonated a nuclear device or done some other form of testing or taken some other unacceptable action, more sanctions have been imposed. I don't think, frankly, even the way we did it in 1695 and 1718 was right. I think when you impose sanctions incrementally over a long period of time, the country being sanctioned finds ways to mitigate against the sanctions. I think Iran was expert at that, as was North Korea. I think sanctions, to be effective, have to be imposed massively and then enforced. And that's something we should learn going forward. We now have a body of Security Council resolutions and U.S. statutes that make up this web of sanctions. The issue today is, are they being enforced effectively? Same question you can ask with respect to Iran, and the answer is they're not being enforced effectively. We've seen the development of something that I'm sure occurred in the past, but which was never much the subject of conversation. We now call ship-to-ship transfers. Ships come out of North Korea, they transfer coal or other materials onto other ships and then take them around the world. Ships coming to North Korea drop off oil onto ships that then take them into port. These ship-to-ship transfers, the same thing is occurring with oil from Iran around the Middle East, take place at sea, they take place.
And one of the fake numbers that we've heard over the last 25 plus years that I've been covering this issue is that the current population of illegal aliens in the country is 13 million. How long have they been telling us that? 25 plus years. That figure is derived from an old study by the Pew Research Center. And the actual figure that the mainstream media, if it wasn't made up of open borders ideologues, would tell you is that it is upwards of 30 million. And that didn't come from the right-wing echo chamber. It was actually Princeton University researchers in the last couple of years who have updated it. All it took was 19 hijackers who came through the front door to blend in among this massive population of upwards of 30 million people and exploit every last loophole, failure of enforcement, and lack of communication. So I was at a debate on a local TV station in Washington, D.C. last week. And when I reminded this woman and the host, the anchor, who, it was 2-on-1, it always is, right? Moderators. Immoderators, right? When I reminded them that it was the week of the 18th anniversary of September 11th, and many of these hijackers who had lived in the DC area had been stopped by Maryland state troopers or local police for speeding. But since there was no way to check on their immigration status and detect them, they were let go. And several of them then traveled to the other part of the Beltway swamp in the south, to sanctuary cities and counties, Fairfax County, Arlington, where they met with illegal alien day laborers who hooked them up with means of acquiring driver's licenses. The driver's licenses and ID that allowed them to board the planes that they then flew into the World Trade Centers, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I don't know how I could connect the dots any clearer in this nexus between getting control of every aspect of our immigration enforcement and national security. But the glazed eyes of leftist media types and Soros minions like this woman when I bring up 9/11, or rude laughter when I bring it up, is absolutely appalling to me. It speaks to a collective amnesia that exists in this country about the lessons we were supposed to have learned. And so I think it is incredibly important what the Remembrance Project does on 9/11. But we have to remember that remembrance without resolve is useless, and resolve without action is just a recipe for more of the same catastrophes that we have seen.
And now to close the side opposition and the debate as a whole, we have Dr. Benny Peiser. Benny is a social anthropologist specializing in environmental and socio-economic impacts. He is also a visiting fellow at the University of Buckingham. Benny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. I'm opposing today's motion because I regard as perhaps the most inhumane and amoral motion ever proposed at the Cambridge Union. Let me explain. You may laugh. People outside these halls and outside Britain and outside Europe don't laugh. What the motion suggests is that societies and governments should abandon the traditional goal of economic growth while prioritizing policies to decarbonize. In short, economic growth and development should be sacrificed in the name of climate protection. Thankfully, not a single government in the world, not even the IPCC, is advocating this kind of economic self-harm, nor is any country or any government even close to adopting a motion that is extremely dangerous. And thankfully, no one outside of Europe is any longer listening to European Greens, radical Greens, that are advocating something that the rest of the world cannot accept. Nevertheless, the fact that stopping economic development is even being advocated by some of the world's most privileged students. I don't want to use the name or the word spoiled, but that's what many outside these facilities may think about the kind of comments we've heard, reveals how far removed this green bubble is from the harsh reality of billions of people who are desperately trying to escape poverty. Let's not beat about the bush. If today's motion would ever be implemented by some radical green government or tin pot dictator, it would lead to the death of millions of poor people in the developing world, astronomical mass unemployment, and economic collapse. That's because poor nations without economic growth have no future and are unable to raise living standards for their impoverished populations. But we don't need to speculate what green subsidies and climate taxes have already done to people struggling with rising energy costs. As these taxes and subsidies have driven up energy prices all over Europe, a growing number of families are forced to decide whether they heat their homes or whether they can buy food. For millions of people all over Europe, the EU's green energy policy has proven to be an economic and social disaster. And most of you, I guess you don't even care that this whole agenda has led to the biggest wealth transfer in the history of modern Europe from poor to rich. Just imagine who is reaping the hundreds of billions that are going into renewables. It's the landowners, it's the people who can afford solar panels, solar farms, biogas. It's those people who can afford all this green stuff paid by ordinary families, by poor families who are forced to pay the rich for their virtual signaling. 20 times as many people die each year from cold-related illness than from heat. And you want to cool the planet? The Office of National Statistics in England and Wales shows that based on past numbers, 1 million Brits are expected to die from cold in their homes by 2050. Do people in this room really want to cool the planet? By how many degrees? Energy poverty is sweeping Europe. Germany, which is one of the richest countries in the world, 15% of the population live in fuel poverty. This year alone, 300,000 families have had their electricity switched off. And they're literally sitting in the dark because they can no longer pay their electricity bills. 6 million German families have been threatened with the same fate because if they don't pay up. And that's happening in one of the world's richest countries. So while Europe is pleased with its green policy, is stagnating and losing its competitive edge, much of Asia, in contrast, is booming, mainly due to its increasing reliance on cheap and abundant oil and gas and coal. And this is going to get much, much, much stronger. The International Energy Agency this week published its new report expecting... Pardon? Yes?
Why then is China such an enthusiastic partner in the Paris Agreement? Why is it that Chinese people are complaining about the smog that's ruining their cities as a result of this breakneck coal-fired expansion?
Well, these are two questions. The one... these are two very good questions. Why is China so enthusiastic? Well, because China was pressured for many years to do something, and what they got was the Paris Agreement, which basically gives China a blank check. And with the air pollution, this is because they have a lot of old power plants, just like Britain had 50, 60 years ago. You may have heard in history that London's air was similarly polluted a long time ago, and the power plants now have to be cleaned up. Nothing to do with CO2, by the way. It's about real pollution, real air pollution, and it's about all power plants. But let me come back to remind you of the challenges in the developing world. Africa, with 1.2 billion people and 20% global landmass, makes just 3% of the world's electricity. Half of Africa's population, 600 million people, have no access to energy whatsoever. China, in contrast, with a similar amount of people, a little bit more, generates 12 times more energy as Africa. And why? Because China is basically burning everything they can find. right? So you think, well, China is such a green country. No, China isn't a real green country. They are building conventional power plants, 1 or 2 power plants per week, and they are not stopping at this point. Yes, please.
But economically, what do you think is going to happen to those countries when the coal and the oil runs out?
Good point. That's a very good point, because that was a fear that drove part of the green agenda over the last 30, 40 years. The fear that we would run out of coal and oil and gas, and therefore alternative energies and nuclear energy were regarded as solution. Along came the shale revolution in the US. We are swimming in conventional fossil fuel energy, which is part of the problem for the green movement, because there is now too much conventional fossil fuel energy. There is no risk that any country will run out of affordable, cheap energy, at least for the next 50 years. I don't know about... Pardon?
That's the first fact you got right.
Well, I'm so pleased to hear that you're approving. It's good at least to have one person on this side approving. If you have one side, it's already gone, or has it chirped? Already gone. Yeah. Listen, the growing anger of many Africans about Europe's green obsession and hypocrisy. Because let's face it, you're all flying in, I don't know how often, on holiday in airplanes and are spending crazy and want good salaries. All this. Am I allowed to say crap here? All this crap about money, we don't care about money. Money doesn't buy love, and we don't need money. Come on, pull another one. All the growing anger about Europeans' hypocrisy, Europeans preaching the rest of the world not to use the energy which made us wealthy, right? Which made Britain wealthy, Europe wealthy, America wealthy. Can I finish the sentence at least?
Yeah.
Was brilliantly summed up by Nigerian Finance Minister Mrs. Kimi Addison. And listen carefully, guys, so that you know what African leaders think about the kind of unfortunate, well-meaning but unfortunate stuff that was said today. And listen carefully. She said, we in Nigeria have coal, but we have a power problem. Yet we've been blocked because it's not green. There is some hypocrisy because we have the entire Western industrialization built on coal energy. That is the competitive advantage that the West has been using. Now Africa wants to use coal, and suddenly they are saying, no, you have to use solar and wind, which is much more expensive. After polluting the environment for hundreds of years, and now that we want to use coal, Europeans are saying no. That is the hypocrisy at the core of the problem. The goal of humanists and humanitarians cannot be to deny the world's poorest access to cheap and reliable energy. This is what today's motion, I'm almost done, sorry, is essentially about. At its very core, this motion is deeply wicked and should be rejected by everyone who takes the urgent needs of the world's poor into consideration rather than prioritizing an intolerant, if well-meaning, green agenda that is hurting millions of people. Thank you.